Hi, I'm Sean Fitzpatrick, and I am the executive director of the Jung Center here in Houston, Texas. And the Jung Center is a proud partner in Compassionate Houston, which is a network of nonprofit organizations that are devoted in some way to serving others, the suffering of others, through compassionate work. And it is a privilege and an honor to be here with you right now, and to welcome you to this conversation with Dr. James Doty, who is a professor at the University of California, Stanford, and he is also a neurosurgeon and the author of a beautiful book called Into the Magic Shop. This was a deeply meaningful conversation for me, and I'm so glad that you can be a part of it. Well, so what I'll do here is I'll just start by acknowledging why we're here, and so we are here because we are using this as a way to mark the beginning of Compassion Week here in Houston, Texas. And in Houston, we have a wonderful organization, a collaborative of many different nonprofits and individuals called Compassionate Houston that works to advance understanding of the charter, awareness of it, and the work of compassion in our community in Houston. And we're just so grateful, Jim Doty, that you could join us today to have a conversation about the subject, which I know is so close to your heart.
Well, thank you. Well, it's really a joy and a pleasure to be with you. I love you folks. As you know, I've been out there and spoke at Compassion Week a few years ago. And so, no, it's great.
It was I had the honor of being there at that talk, and it was just the audience was rapt. You know that the proverbial pin could drop, and you could hear it as your story of your own journey to discovering compassion and the power of compassion is deeply compelling. And I'd like to start with that. I know that you have many stories that you can tell us, but I'd really kind of like to start with you as you entered the magic shop, or sort of life before you entered the magic shop, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So you lived with in a pretty difficult home environment. You had a father who was alcoholic and really sporadically employed. Mother was depressed and had epilepsy and was suicidal at times. You had an older brother who really sounded like really struggled as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to grow up in that home?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, each of our pasts on some level contributes or dictates our future. And at the time, and I was 12 years old, I had grown up in this environment as you described. And I don't want to say in any way that, my parents were not kind and loving, but that being said, they were so wrapped up in their own personal issues that they struggled to take care of themselves. And as a result, my brother and I were often ignored in terms of what you would consider nourishment or caring. And when you grow up in that type of an environment, you realize one of the things you want so much is to be cared for. You want somebody to help you with the schedule, someone to assist you with your homework, someone to, give you guidelines about how to move forward. And in those environments, of course, you don't really have that. And the other aspect of it is, and now we call it adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, is that each of these aspects can contribute to a less likelihood of you being successful or making a contribution to society in the future. If you have drug and alcohol abuse, if you have violence, if you have a parent with mental illness, if you're in poverty, each of these things contributes. And in some ways, it's a form of constant trauma. You never know what your schedule is, things are chaotic. And as a result, this engages your sympathetic nervous system. And by that, what I mean is that when you're fearful, when you're anxious, this kicks in the system, which has all sorts of negative physiologic effects. And this is our flight, fight, fear, freeze mode. And it's a survival mode where you're just trying to get through that moment. And it's one that's not very effective in thoughtful decision making. You're just trying to get through that moment. And when you grow up in that type of an environment, without mentors, without access, without money, without guidance, it's scary and lonely. And the very nature of that creates stress and anxiety. And that was the position I was in. The other aspect that happens is when you feel that you don't have a future, you don't really care about the present. What I mean by that is this is why so commonly, children in these environments become delinquents, they get into drugs and all sorts of negative behaviors because they don't see a possibility of a future. And
they're looking for ways to have a different experience, right? They're looking for ways to connect, so they connect with with other delinquents, right? They connect with people who will give them
anyone who will accept them and make them part of a group, because what allows us to thrive on some level is this sort of social connection where you're accepted and people value your opinion, and that can happen in a good environment or a very bad environment. And so when I would get anxious or afraid, one of the things I would do to avoid that situation was I would get on my orange Stingray bicycle and ride as fast as I could away.
Yeah.
And that was obviously both literally and figuratively. And one time I did that and I ended up at a strip mall far from my house, which I hadn't been before. And at the strip mall was a magic shop, and I had interest in magic. And what happened is I walked into the magic shop, and one of the things that occurred was there was this woman sitting there, and she was had this long flowing gray hair, and she had her glasses on the tip of her nose with a chain on them, and she was reading a paperback. But she looked up, and she very quickly informed me that she knew nothing about magic. She was the owner's mother and was just sitting there waiting for him to return while he did an errand. Yeah. But the thing about her that was quite extraordinary was that she had this radiant smile. And it was one of these smiles that immediately makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel that in some ways that you're wanted, that you have a direct connection to her, that she's not looking down on you, she's looking at you as an equal. And what happens in an environment like that, especially when you're used to being dismissed or being ignored, is that, in some ways it wakes you up and gets your own attention. And we ended up having a very wonderful conversation, but it was very much directed by her because she clearly intuited some of my own anxiety and fearfulness. And we talked for about 20 minutes, and she asked me some very penetrating questions, which I would normally not have that discussion with somebody who I didn't know. And I answered them truthfully. And at the end of it, she said to me, I really like you. I'm here for another 6 weeks. And if you come in every day, I'll teach you something that I think could really help you. And I tell people, I wish I could say, I had this incredible insight about this gift she was going to give me, and that's why I showed up. I had no insight whatsoever. I was a lost 12-year-old kid who was looking for affirmation. This was a person who was very nice to me. I frankly had nothing else to do, and
Yeah.
she was offering me chocolate chip cookies. So, uh,
Yeah.
that's why I showed up. But what happened over that period of 6 weeks, though, ultimately changed the trajectory of my own life
Yeah.
and allowed me to look at the world from a different perspective than I had previously looked at it.
She told you that as I hear you tell the story, I hear um, just how, I don't know quite the right word to use. Lucky is the one that comes to mind, right? There's so many different ways that story could have played out, and that she was giving you attention, and she also had really benevolent intentions. And uh, what she told you, and it's just how you narrated in the book, is that she could teach you real magic. And it was so compelling to me that what then she taught you, she understood in its way to be magic. Can you talk a little bit about what that kind of really an apprenticeship process you went through was like?
No, exactly. And it's funny. I think there's a quote that I came up with that real magic is fake, and fake uh, magic is real. And what she taught me was in some ways magical because it gave me insights into looking at the world a different way, and from that different perspective, changed the course of how I interacted with the world, which changed how the world interacted with me, and then gave me new possibilities. And yeah, so the first thing that she taught me, because I was a scared, anxious individual, I didn't know that I had this constant trauma, that I was living in this world of engagement of my sympathetic nervous system, where I was always looking around, waiting for the unexpected. And so the first thing she taught me was uh, relaxing the body. And at that time, of course, there was no mindfulness or meditation or neuroplasticity. These terms weren't used, but she clearly had had some exposure to Eastern type of practices. And she taught me a breathing exercise that, combined with this relaxation technique, allowed me to be relaxed and shut that down. And what happens is that when you're able to migrate from engagement of your sympathetic nervous system to your parasympathetic nervous system, you go from the survival mode to one of much more thoughtful and discerning interaction in your brain, because you have access to that part of your brain, which we call your executive control function.
Yeah.
This gives you access to memories, prior experiences, different events, so that you can actually process information in a much more logical manner and in a much more helpful manner. So when I became relaxed and calmed down, my heart rate slowed down, my blood pressure decreased, and of course now we know also my immune system was boosted. The creation of inflammatory proteins actually dramatically diminished. And, inflammatory proteins are associated with a lot of disease states. And so when that happened, the other magical thing that occurred was I could be present. Because if you're looking around all the time and you're trying to figure out what's going on or what's going to happen to you, it's hard to concentrate and to be present. And of course, if you want to succeed in life, you have to be present and be able to process the information versus being distracted by all these other negative possibilities that could happen to you. So that was really the first lesson she taught me.
And you took
And
it seriously. You went home and practiced it. And
absolutely.
yeah, I'm curious about it. Like, did it? You could feel the effect. You could feel yourself changing. Was that what that kept you doing it in that moment, or was it
Well,
Yeah,
I
it's
think that
more
to,
complicated.
early on, I didn't see any effect, right? Uh, but the other aspect is that, you know, this woman was giving me her time and doing this, and of course I'd keep seeing her, and that sort of motivated me to continue the practice. And at some point, though, it actually kicked in, and I really experienced the effects and noticed how I wasn't as bothered at home by these other events that were going on. I
Yeah.
also found that simply sitting and doing these breathing exercises put me into a calm state where I wasn't as reactionary to
Right.
so many other things that were going on in my environment. So it had, a number of positive aspects. And the next thing she taught me once I had understood this was she also made me understand that all the negative comments that were going on in my head all the time, which I thought were truth and real, were narratives that I had created based on information that was coming to me, but it wasn't necessarily correct information.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that negativity sticks to us much more than positive comments,
Mhm.
because the negative things, if you look back at our evolution as a species, are the things that put us at risk.
Yeah.
And as a result, we are tuned to those and process those. As an example, if the grass is moving, you know that there's a lion there or something, and you should get out of the way. But the problem with that is that one of the side effects of that is any potentially negative comment that you think is about you sticks to you. And that is the negative narrative of I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I can't do this, people will judge me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result, every time you do that, it's like building a prison cell. Each of those comments is like a brick. And at some point, it is caging you in, and it's starting to get very dark. And the other problem with it is that here we have, starting out as a child, if you will, have unlimited capacity to accomplish things. And each time one accepts these negative comments, it's taking some of that power away until at some point people feel unable to do anything. And sometimes that turns into this narrative of victimhood.
Right.
And the reality is, once you say you cannot do something effectively, it's impossible to do it. And so the statement you made is correct. And what she taught me then was that narrative was a false narrative. And she used the analogy of a radio station that I was tuned to, and that it was my choice to change that channel. And what she taught me to do was to change it to one of self-affirmation, one of positivity, one of telling myself that I'm worthy, that I deserve to be loved, that I'm smart, that I can uh, accomplish anything.
Right.
And as a result, um, it made me see the world in a completely different way, because, when you get into this self-rumination and this constant negativity about yourself, you don't appreciate that it, in some ways, skews your view of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Because when you're negative to yourself, then you look at the world through a negative lens, and you become very hypercritical and very judgmental of people. And as a result, um, frankly, a lot of people don't want to be around you. And and also, you don't appreciate that your manner in which you carry yourself, and humans have an incredible ability to intuit emotional states from people's facial expressions, their voice intonation, their body habitus, even their smell. And if you're transmitting negative feelings out, well, generally people don't want to be around those and they avoid you, or they don't give you the benefit of the doubt, or they judge you. And so that experience of being able to change that narrative allowed me to change my perspective of the world. And so when I changed how I viewed the world, I tell people that it changed how the world viewed me. And
Yep.
it
Yeah.
became a much kinder, gentler world. Plus, the other aspect was I used to have a lot of anger and hostility towards my parents because in some ways they were letting me down, and they weren't doing what they needed to do. And I realized, though, that they had their own limited capacity, and that, you know, my father or my mother didn't have the tools to deal with those issues that were causing them so much pain. And so I forgave them and let go of that anger and hostility. You know, what I realized also was, as an example, over my right shoulder is this picture of the Dalai Lama, and it's in black and white. And it's an interesting example because it documents an event. But the problem is, it's like a memory. A memory is just an event, but we paint it with the color of our emotion.
Yeah.
And that is what goes into our memory. And when we think of it, we don't see the black and white picture. We see this photograph of all the anger, hostility, and everything associated with that individual or that particular event. And each time we bring it up, it triggers our own negative emotions because we're not seeing it like an event. And so it allowed me to essentially change those memories to simply events, and without a negative or a positive, that they were just an event. And that, in many ways, released me from an immense amount of anger and hostility, and made me understand that it is in my hands, in some ways, to control my own destiny and to look at the world through a different lens.
So I want to unpack that just a little bit, because what I hear are two things. One is, as you've been reflecting on this process, which you've described in about 5 minutes, but I know was years long, right? Process of coming to reimagine your history and your relationships with your parents. But what came before that, and I think is just as crucial and is really moving to me about your book, is, but in order to do that, you have to, in your language, you have to be able to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, or you have to be able to get out of that state of hyperarousal, which you were in through your entire childhood, right?
Yeah.
So you needed a technique, you needed a way of getting, and I kept thinking of the word shame as you were talking about the brick wall that you were building. Like that's shame, and you needed a practical way of feeling what you're feeling and starting to change how you felt before some of these other realizations could happen. Is that a fair way of talking about it? Or yeah?
I think that's exactly correct. And so she gave me, if you will, the toolbox that allowed me to do that. And I was a diligent student, and obviously it had a dramatic effect, because the other thing that happened is, once I was able to relax my body and tame the mind, if you will, I was then able to open my heart in the sense of understanding that everyone is suffering, and it's not just about me. And that was a revelation, because, as I said, the self-rumination in some ways is a very selfish activity, and it's one you do alone. And you get very caught up in that, and woe is me, versus look it out and realizing that so many people are in pain and suffering.
Yeah. So, can you talk about that move when you started to see other people's suffering? Do you have? I'm curious about that. How did that happen for you?
Well, once I was able to be kind to myself and give self-affirmation, I was much more interested in the stories of other people and what they were going through, and this simply led to a lot of different conversations with others, and that probably I would not have had. Even my brother, he was going through a lot of pain, and he was my older brother, but I frankly never really was interested or listened.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, he identified as being gay, and he had a lot of challenges with those around him because of that. And even though on some level I had always been protective of him because I was bigger, and it made me much more understanding about what he was going through.
Yeah.
Because I'd really never thought of it before.
Yeah.
And as I talk about in the book, the experience with this bully, I had been bullied, but watching somebody do that to somebody else is very painful.
Yes.
So, and probably normally I would have just walked past it. So, it really opened my eyes to the experiences of other people.
Is it you? I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about, and maybe what just happened to you might be a way into it. But talk a little bit about empathy and compassion. Um,
Sure.
we know the root of compassion is to suffer with, right? Etymologically, so, and what I witnessed, what I just saw as you told the story, was your own opening to that suffering of your brother. Um, so, can you talk a little bit about what empathy and compassion, how we might understand them together and separately?
Well, in some ways, it's it's how you view the world and how you engage in the world, and how you identify the other. If you look at the spectrum, you have pity, which is someone who recognizes someone's suffering, but they do it from a position of being superior, looking down on them.
Yeah.
You have sympathy, which in some ways it's a cognitive understanding of somebody's suffering, and that you see their suffering and you feel bad about it. And then there's empathy, which is you're actually taking on the emotional state of another person, right? This is where you're actually suffering with them. You feel their pain. Now, that's not to say you can have empathic joy as well. But, in the context of our discussion, we're talking about, painful experiences or watching somebody suffering. But that type of empathy doesn't necessarily, it can be painful for you, but it doesn't necessarily change the situation at all.
Right. Right.
Okay, so it's not active. And compassion is the recognition of another's suffering with a motivational desire to alleviate that suffering.
Yeah.
And when I say motivational desire, sometimes we're not able to alleviate it, but we want to alleviate it. And with each of those, your engagement gets closer and closer and closer to the actual person, where you really feel what they're feeling, and you don't want them to suffer anymore. And this is, at the empathy side and the compassion side is essentially the opportunity to actively engage versus, pitting someone or being sympathetic doesn't necessarily require that at all.
It feels like I was going to say a calling, right? It's in that moment of empathy, it's something more that calls for a response of some kind. And um,
Yes, and perhaps a compelling response.
yes, yeah, a compelling response. Yeah, it's the story in the book about the bully involved you putting yourself in danger pretty directly, and that was how compassion was enacted in that moment. That you had to insert yourself, and it had a positive outcome. Not wouldn't necessarily always have that outcome.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, some ways someone could say it was foolish, uh, but um, this is choices we have to make. Now, I certainly couldn't blame someone if, they don't put themselves out there because, they have a job and they have to support their family. And if they do that, they could lose their job or some of these other things. But, that being said, each of us is called upon to make some of these decisions. And sometimes we use narratives that justify our behavior that are not really justifiable. And what
Yeah.
I mean by that is we'll make an excuse because we don't really want to get involved. We don't want to pay the price.
Right.
Um, but of course, if you reflect on that and you, again, are able to put uh, yourself in that position, you want somebody to come and help you, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's important that as best as you can, you think about that
Yeah.
because, nothing is worse than being in a situation like being in a ocean without a life preserver. And, you can see that, ship far off and, you're screaming and yelling and there's no one who comes for you. And, if you think about your own life, the events that stick with you deepest um, are those in which, in some ways, you've saved somebody.
Yeah.
You've reached out.
Yes.
Uh, so I think that's very important. And when you sort of recount the meaningful uh, events in your life, it's events like that that come to mind because they stick with you at a very deep level, and in some ways are the gift of defining your humanity.
Yes. As I listen to you, it's clear how open your heart is and remains, how present those experiences remain for you. And one of the questions that I um, have been preoccupied with as a therapist over time has been how to hold that um, connectedness with the suffering of others in a way that's sustainable over time.
Well, I think that's the key is sustainable over time. You know, you can be eaten up by these types of emotions, especially if your capacity to intervene or alleviate is limited. And, you know, each of us can only do the best we can. Obviously, as a physician, I deal with these issues frequently, especially as a neurosurgeon. And, you know, when I am there, I give myself as much as I can. But on the other side of it is that event happens and I can turn and be back to myself. And it's interesting because showing those emotions, you know, doesn't put me in a continual funk where I'm depressed and upset. Uh, I'm there, I'm living it, I'm with them, I feel it, I give to them, but then I can go on and be back. And, you know, maybe in some ways it's a gift. I don't know. But, you know, that's how I handle it, because obviously doing surgery on someone, I can't, you know, be teary eyed and going through all these thoughts about, well, what happens if I am not able to save them, or this doesn't happen, or something like that. I have to be sort of a technician who doesn't ever let those things come in. And, you know, I mentioned this in the book, this experience where, in fact, I did let those emotions come in and I couldn't function. I think it is important to be able to connect with that emotion, but you also have to have boundaries about how far you will go. And the reality is also, you know, showing these types of emotions isn't a sign of weakness that you're just bowled over all the time by, you know, minor events and you're just weeping all the time. And in many ways, it's an incredible sign of strength, I believe. But you also have to have boundaries, and you have to be kind to yourself and have a method where you can recharge your batteries, feel safe, and understand your own limitations.
That idea of being kind to yourself, I think, is as I interact on an ongoing basis with people who are drawn to serving others, healthcare professionals, and also social workers, social service providers, clergy, so on, even attorneys, advocates, activists, that there's an openness to the suffering of others that doesn't include themselves, right? And this is a general statement, right? But the people who are drawn to this work tend to do it and not, and the hard work of actually seeing their own woundedness, their own, as you said, the adverse childhood experiences, right? The own places that actually have drawn them to the work, make them good at it, that they avoid looking at their own suffering. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that kindness. And we talked a little bit about self-compassion too. Yeah.
No, you're exactly right. You know, I always say that people who go into these fields are broken people oftentimes, right?
Yeah.
They go into it because, and it's at a subconscious level, they feel a need to heal the wounds of others, but it's a manifestation of the wounds that they carry.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, oftentimes it's, if I could just heal one more person, if I could just do one more good thing, then I'll be okay. And it doesn't work that way.
Right. And
Uh,
it's often a repetition of the childhood. It's a repetition of what you. I mean, for you, not to comment directly on your experience, but you were the caregiver for the family. You were the functional person in the family, and you're going to repeat that over the course of your life if you're not aware of it.
no, absolutely. And while on the one hand, if you have capacity and it's, if you will, at a healthy fashion, not that you create that environment, that can be a good thing. But yes, if you keep putting yourself into these situations of the brokenness of others, and you're going out to take care of everyone, yeah, and it's only going to lead to a lot of pain and suffering for yourself. And again, as you were pointing out, unless you can identify that and deal with your own suffering, and if you will, let go of that, it's going to be this repeating theme, and it's not going to be beneficial for you.
It's I can't I can't say that enough. And I'm so glad to hear you. I'm so glad to hear you say it. And as you talked about people being drawn to this profession, being broken people, I have to immediately own that for myself. Like it's, in childhood, often we learn these skills about how to be attuned to the emotional environment around us when we're in difficult emotional environments. And those are skills that will serve us well in these professions. But it's a trick to learn how to turn that off.
Well, exactly. And it's funny. I give lectures all the time about this stuff. And, invariably, I will tell some story or another, which will be emotional. And, my voice will crack or I'll shed a tear. And I remember at the end of one of my talks, a woman comes up to me and she goes, "Gosh, I was watching you up there and I was so embarrassed for you. I mean, you must have just felt absolutely horrible that all these people are watching you and you're showing tears, your voice is cracking. Clearly you were dealing with this emotion." And she said, "I'm a psychiatrist and a hypnotherapist." And she says, "If you come and see me for 3 sessions, I'll get rid of that for you."
I can cure you of your humanity.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because how this person would perceive that as that I should be ashamed of that and that it's going to affect me in a negative way. And the thing is, what's fascinating is, I'll be giving these talks, and then as soon as my voice does crack or I shed a tear, everyone starts crying because they're asking permission to show their own humanity. And they very, very few situations allow you, to be that authentic and know that it's okay and that you're still accepted. And I think that's really very important for people, because part of the problem is that in modern society it's so different from how, let's say, we lived a few hundred years ago. At that time you lived in the same village your whole life. You lived with your parents, your grandparents, your siblings. Everyone in the area knew you. They knew you from the time you were a baby all the way up to adulthood, and they saw every good part of you and every bad part. And the thing is, they loved you regardless, right? You were accepted, you were loved, no matter how much you screwed up. There was someone who would still give you a hug, and you weren't fearful of being judged.
Yeah.
In modern society, unfortunately, because we don't have that, you don't have people close to you oftentimes who are able to let you be your true self, let you share your emotions, be there for you. And as a result, people have a tendency, first of all, not to tell the truth. I mean, you could be working next to a cubicle of somebody and every day you say hello, or you may share lunch, but you never tell them that, your partner has cancer or your child's been arrested or some other horrible event has occurred, because you don't want to be judged by them. And the same is even true of, even bringing them over to your house sometimes, that, somebody may embarrass you or something. And, and it's very unfortunate because it then requires you to put up this shield that protects you from that. And the shield is, well, I have this degree and I have that degree and I have this title and I have this job and therefore I'm important. And it's tragic.
I don't know anything about that.
Yeah.
It is tragic.
Yeah, and so I think giving people that freedom is very important. People ask me, "Geez, you have a relationship with the Dalai Lama and some of these other faith leaders, Amma, Sri Sri, and others," and they go, "What's it like in the presence of these people?" And what I tell people is the extraordinary thing, and you can see why these people have these followers, is these people accept people as they are, not how they wish them to be.
Yeah.
And when you're accepted as you are and you're given unconditional love as you are, that's extraordinarily appealing. I can recount being with the Dalai Lama and just being in this presence and this incredible joyfulness about him. You just feel so calm, you feel elevated, you feel good. I was with Amma, the hugging saint. I don't know if you know her, but she's a friend of mine, and I see her whenever she's in California. She has an ashram here. But and she always brings me on stage every time I go. So I'm often sitting next to her. But somebody was telling me, they're going, I was just watching up you had this big smile and you just look so happy, and it's true, because there's nothing else on your mind. You're just like in this moment, feeling this love, and you don't have all the normal barriers that you would have in sort of regular society. And so I understand why people want to constantly feed off of that and be near that.
It's what that's connecting with for me is that we're here in part to mark the Compassion Week and the importance of the Charter for Compassion. And people watching this at this point likely have read the Charter. If they haven't, it's 3 paragraphs long and easily accessible online, and encourage you to read it. One of the things that the Charter emphasizes is the deep interdependence of all human beings. And just in that moment, I hear the emotional interdependence at work, right? Just being around someone like Amma who is so present,
Yes.
right? Has it affects the entire room, the entire space that she occupies.
Well, and this is actually the power of fearlessness. And what I mean by that is to be who you are without the fear of any judgment, and let that radiate out. Because once you remove those barriers, in some ways, you have this infinite capacity to connect, to care, to love without fear. And this is actually what people wish to be around. They wish to be around people who carry that, who in every space they enter, there's this energy, this lightness, this love that they feel when they're around that person. And, and it's a capacity that every one of us has. There's a book, it's called Transcendence by a guy named Kaufman that recently came out. And it talks about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's interesting because in some ways he has written about what actually I have talked about a fair amount as well, which is, beyond self-actualization is the next level, which is transcendence, where you don't see any separation between you or anything else, especially other humans. And therefore the other is you.
Yeah.
And when you can try to live that as best you can and be that, that is really as close as any of us can get to being godlike, if you believe in God. But you're right. I mean, we need everyone, and we are everyone. It's funny. I do not use psychedelics, generally speaking. Uh, uh, but I'll tell you a quick story. You know, my wife has, and I guess I do too, have a variety of friends, and two in particular, I would call them seekers, you know, and they go see the Dalai Lama or Amma or whoever. But around the same time, each of them came, and one said, you know, I met this shaman and he is really into iboga. And I don't know if you know iboga. It's an African, West African, I think it's a bark. And you take it, ingest it, and then you have these metaphysical or mystical experiences. And she was saying, you know, I tried this and it's just has given me incredible insights and I'm much more connected, et cetera, et cetera. Then this other friend said, oh, you know, I have this shaman friend and she's introduced me to something called the toad, which is Bufo alvaris, which is a short acting psychedelic. And they initially told my wife this, and my wife comes to me, start talking. She goes, you know, I really want to do this. This is amazing stuff. And, you know, gosh, I would love to have that connection, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had this conversation. I said, well, you know, I guess then you should do it. I mean, that's great. And then she goes, no, but you have to do it first and make sure. So I said, sure, okay, I'll do it. And so I did both of these things.
Yeah.
And the iboga one is you fast from a Friday morning, you take the drug in the evening of Friday, and then every couple hours you take more of it. And it's guided by a shaman who, in some ways, you're forced to look at your shadow self and also this baggage you carry about your own childhood or experiences. And, you know, obviously I've done a lot of that work. And so for me, it wasn't particularly traumatic. And ultimately it was a fine experience. And I think it was at the end of the day for everyone, but a lot of people were crying and weeping and all of this stuff. But I found it interesting. I wouldn't necessarily do it again, but the interesting thing about the toad, which is something you smoke, is that getting back to this oneness, it was interesting because, you know, I watch these other people do this and they're sort of having babbling experiences about actually sometimes even mundane things, but they're going, oh, wow, that's, but for me, what happened was, and what it does is it takes you from the present moment, sort of like a million miles an hour out into the universe. But I was like sitting out in space surrounded by stars, and I had this sense of merging into everything.
Yeah.
And it was just this incredible deep love.
Yeah.
And for me, I just sat there with this smile on my face, weepy tears of joy.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately that is how we should see our place in this world, to be able to do that, to give that as best we can.
And to have that kind of revelation, right? Whether it comes from a chemical or from sustained meditative practices, or some people have spontaneous experiences, right? Underlies a fundamental reality, right? It gives you an opportunity to see something that is already true and already present for us. But it does take a deliberate practice for many of us, I should say, of drawing our attention to that.
Yes.
Yes.
And you know, I would say I don't need any drugs to do that.
Yeah, right, right.
But you're right. I mean, it does take some practice. And the problem is, you could call it dissolution of the ego, if you wish to, because, you know, we're always bombarded by these other things in life which want our attention and beg for our attention, and they distract us from seeing this interdependence and this connection, oftentimes, you know, to other people. What people forget is that, if you look at all the data that comes in from our various senses, I mean, and I'm guessing on some level, but it's somewhere between these numbers. It's like 3 million to 6 million bits of information come from all of your sensory organs in your body, right to your brain. But we're only limited to being able to process on a conscious level 50 to 100.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so there's so much stuff you miss that most people are putting their attention in different places, but they're not sitting with these other realities that are also going on around them.
And so sitting at the Jung Center, and we speak that language pretty well. That idea that the ego is actually pretty small, and the whole of the psyche is vast, and
Yes.
there's so much that we're not tuned into, we're attending to. Um, I'm mindful of the time. We have gone. We've gone to the time band. Thank you so much. What a brilliant
Thank
talk.
you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much.
A joy and a pleasure. And if I can do anything further, let me know.
We really want to thank Dr. James Doty for allowing us to have this really meaningful conversation. It was really meaningful for me, and I have to say that it is really rare in my life to sit with someone who is so present to their feeling and who understands it as not as a weakness, but as the foundation of strength for him, as it so clearly has been. He's touched countless people's lives, and boy, what an honor! And I'm so grateful to you for being a part of the conversation. And it's not over. On October the 16th, on Friday, we will be having a live question and answer session with Dr. Doty on Zoom. Compassionate Houston will be sending a link to you once we get a little bit closer to it, so be on the lookout for that. I really do hope you can join us. If you have questions that came up or things you'd like to hear him reflect upon in more detail, please don't hesitate to bring them with you. And the Jung Center remains a proud partner of Compassionate Houston, and deeply enriched by its work. On behalf of all of the partners of this network in Compassionate Houston, I just want to thank you for joining us, and we very much look forward to continuing the conversation.